Hello guys, welcome back to our introduction to programming with Python series. This is in this video we're going to be covering recursive functions in Python. So what's a recursive function in Python basically? Or this is not just for Python but programming in general. What is a recursive function? So recursive function is just a function that calls itself multiple times. So if a function is calling itself over and over again, it is known as a recursive function. And in Python, you can implement recursive function with the function with the code that's just on my screen right now. So let's learn how to implement recursive functions in Python and see how what are the advantages of recursive function and what are the inner workings of the recursive function. Again, this is not going to be an in-depth talk about recursive function because this course is aimed at absolute beginners. So I'm just going to keep it very simple and explain things on a surface level. But if you really want to dive into recursion in programming is actually a big field. So you can actually dive deeper into recursion. Okay, but I'm just going to go over the surface level. So I'm just going to go into my VS Code and I'm going to create a new file, and that's going to be 24, right? Part 24. So I'm going to say part underscore 24.py. So part 24.py. And once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and let me just keep a comment here. And it's going to be recursive functions in Python. So that's a recursive function in Python. So how do you implement a recursive function in Python? Basically, you just have a function. Let's call it recursive. And basically, recursive function is just a function calling itself over and over again. So function, and then you say recursive. This function is going to call itself, right? So instead of this function, it's actually calling itself. So that's the recursive function. So if I go ahead and call this function outside here, whenever I call this function, it's going to go in here, and in this going to execute the block, right? So it's going to call this part right here. It is going to go ahead and call the function again. So is this going to be like someone standing in front of a mirror, right? So then someone standing in front of two mirrors, right? So each mirror is reflecting image back and forth of each other. So like this mirror reflects this one, the other one reflects that other one, reflects the other one, and it goes on and on again, right? So that's the same thing with recursion. That a function is calling itself over and over and over and over again. So if you're running your programs, this can lead to major issues in Python. Like your program will actually stop executing at some point because it's a program the computer can keep calling itself over, and like function cannot keep calling itself over and over and again. This thing is gonna run for infinite amount of time, right? So in Python, to safeguard things, we have something called as maximum recursive depth, which is going to be a number, and a function can call itself more than 1,000 times. So this is something that you can change in Python, but for most use cases it's just safe to keep it at 1,000, and that's how recursive works. So when you're working with recursive functions, just make sure that you're doing the right thing and you're not just calling a function over and over again. That's you hit the maximum recursion date. So you can see that I actually hit the maximum recursion date right here and say maximum recursion date exceeded, and maximum recursion date is around like 1000 or 996 times, right? So that's the maximum recursion depth. You can't call a function more than that in Python. You can change how this works, but they usually keep it around that value. Okay, so that's how a recursion is basically on a surface level. Again, as I said, I'm not going to go into depth about this. So let's say that you want to find factorial. So if you're coming from mathematics, you understand this factorial, right? Factorial of 4 is just going to be 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. That's a recursion, right? That's a recursive, right? Sorry, that's a factorial of 4, right? So let's write a function to actually do the same thing like this using recursion. So I'm just going to go here, create a function called def. I'm going to factorial. So factorial is actually a classical example used to demonstrate how recursion works in programming. So I'm going to say if n equals to 1, you're just going to go ahead and return 1. So that's basically, so a recursive function must have a point where it returns something, right? Else, which I call the breaking point, I think, else, and you're going to go ahead and simply say return n multiplied by the factorial, which is basically the function call again of n minus 1. So that's how we get this value right here. So we're going to return and exit our function if n equals to 1. Else, you're going to take n multiplied by the factorial of n minus 1. So what's going to go ahead and do, let me just run the code again. Let's make sure everything works, and I'm going to explain to you things in depth. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually run the code again. Let's call this function. So I'm going to say factorial, and I'm going to pass in 4. What's a factorial of 4? Let's read about around. Okay, let's print it out. So let's call this, and I'm just going to go ahead and print out whatever it returns to me. So print it out and go in here and write the code. So the factorial of 24 is the factorial of 4 is indeed 24. So how does this work at the surface levels? Let me just write this and explain to you. So in the first instance, you're calling the factorial passing in 4, right? So what it's going to go ahead and do is going to go ahead inside of our program, n is 4 at this time, right? So this condition is never going to be hit, so it's going to go to the else block and it's going to say 4, right? Because n at the first instance is 4, right? First iteration is going to be 4, and then multiply by the factorial factorial of factorial of what? Of 4 minus 4 minus 1, which is going to be factorial of 3, right? And then it's going to go, this function is going to get called again. So it's going to check, is n equals to 1? No. So it's going to go ahead and say 3, right? So 3. So in the computer's memory, we already had 4. So it's going to be 4 times 3 multiplied by the factorial of 3 minus 1 is going to be factorial of 2. So this function is going to get called again, and it's going to come up here and check n, is n equals to 1? No. So it's going to go down here, it's going to return it's going to repeat this. So it's going to be 2 times a factorial of 2 minus 1. So it's going to go down here, say, already have 4 in memory, we already have 3 in memory, so we're going to also have the factorial of, we also have 2 in memory already, so this is going to be 3, right? So it's going to be 3, and it's going to the factorial of multiplied by the factorial of 3 2 minus 1. 2 minus 1 is going to be 1, so it's going to go call this function right here again, and n is 1 in this case, so n is going to be 1, so it's going to return 1, so it's going to return this to be 1. So it's going to go ahead and be like 4, right? 4 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 2, right? Multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1, and that's how we end up with the value 24. So that's how factorials work. So you can find the factorial of any number using recursion, and recursion is just a function calling itself over and over again. So that's a factorial of 40. Like, that's a ridiculously long number, right? So let's say factorial of 10, and that's also going to be a long number. So that's basically how recursion works in programming. This is a very surface level explanation. Again, as I said, factorials are this like a huge field, like something that you can delve deeper into in programming, but I'm just gonna keep it simple because this course is aimed at absolute beginners, so I don't want to overwhelm you with all the information. So this is just basically how factorials work in Python, not just in Python but in other programming languages as well. Okay, so that's all for this video, and see you in the next one. Again, if you're new to the channel, please kindly consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing this content with anyone who you think might find it helpful. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Keep safe.